Hello ladies, and welcome to Homemakers Radio. I hope you get a lot done while you listen today. And I'm going to show you my teacup before you get started. It's one of those Stitch-all china from Home Goods, but a lot of ladies now are staying home more just because the shopping has become inconvenient or unpleasant. And I'm trying that too, just to see if it improves my home and my mood. And I must say, and I will talk about it later, it really does. But you can order these online. I'll put the name of it on, and you can probably get them at a very similar price. I got these at Home Goods a couple of years ago, and I just love it. Now, sometimes these teacups will form a little bit of grayness right in here where the finish is being worn off, and that could be from the dishwasher. So I try to just hand wash these, even though it says dishwasher safe. It is a little harder on the dishes. Now today I have some things to read to you, and I hope that they will be pleasant. And I want to talk a little bit about getting dressed and getting ready, because it will, even if you're not sure how the day is going to go or what your mood is, if you'll make up your mind to dress up come rain or come shine. Remember that old saying, to dress up come rain or come shine. And remember, the Apostle Paul admonished the young preacher Timothy to preach the word and to be instant in season and out of season. And that just meant when it's convenient, when it's popular, and when it's not, and when it's difficult. You know, when something is in season, it's easy to get, isn't it? And when something is seasonal, it is almost free. But when it's out of season, it's a little more difficult, and so a little bit difficult to prepare, a little bit more difficult to do. So if you will dress, whether it's convenient or not, if you will dress up, at least, even if you don't get anything done, at least you can say that's one thing you accomplished today. So you want to take a break, you can put it on pause and go get ready and get yourself ready and plan to dress as though you are going to do something very important and that you're going to have a beautiful day, a wonderful day. Now today I am going to talk a little bit about the come rain or come shine of your homemaking. Make up your mind when you have got dressed to have a little routine that you do come rain or come shine, no matter what. And if you have little children, they will appreciate the little routine. They'll know what their mother is doing next. They will know what she is up to. They'll know what time it is. They always watch, don't they, to see if mealtime is nearby. They always watch to see what kind of mood she's in. And so I think it's really important to have a stalwart attitude about your homemaking, that come rain or come shine, those dishes will be washed and the bathroom will be sanitized and that the laundry will be done. At least do those. Now recently we've had a lot of farming going on in the area, and I'm in farm country, and they have their water wheels and all the watering going on, and it took quite a bit of water out of the ground and lowered the water table, and my well went dry for a few days. So I had to stop watering outside and limit my washing inside, and I let the laundry go and the dishes go for a day or two, and it all eventually came back. But I realize that there will be some times when you won't be able to do it, but you do the best you can. Now, my mother-in-law used to hand wash her own clothes. This is a skill that is worth teaching your children. I was taught it when I was growing up on the homestead in Alaska. Before we had any kind of automatic washing equipment, we children were taught how to wash our own clothes. And we had a line that we could hang them out on. And I think it's a skill worth teaching your children, and they can keep up with their own laundry perhaps. They might not do a perfect job, but once it's been hung outside and the sun hits it, it kind of sanitizes it. I think that it is a great way to keep up with things when you don't have a lot of water. And that's just an idea. Teach your children how to wash their clothes. Teach them how to wash their socks. Do something that will make them be able to be independent eventually and look after themselves, because we want to fully equip. It isn't just about you being a homemaker. It isn't just about you doing all the housework, because now you'll need to equip fully all members of the family to take over if they have to. If you ever get sick, or if you're not there, or if for some reason they have to live by themselves or take care of themselves. You have fully equipped them. So it isn't just about you getting your work done. It's about you passing on the skills. So as you work, you really need to inspire and teach at the same time and show. And the best way to teach is to go into their room or part of the house that's important to them and start cleaning it up and say what you're doing, and then stand back and let them do a little. And that's, children will respond to someone who is kind and loving in the way that they speak about it and who has a delight in the work. I want to read a little bit today from Booker T. Washington. He explained later on in this book that I read to you last time why so many people chose names like Washington is because previously, before the Emancipation Proclamation, they had a initial. They'd be named George T. or George B. And then they started to add a word to the last name. It's very unusual. But I wanted to read something about what his mother said, and it related in a way to homemaking and freedom at home. Someone really ought to take this book apart and make it into a script, because it would just make a wonderful series of movies. He says here, I recall the impression they made upon me. They did not at the moment seem to be sad because of the loss of property. He's talking about the breakup of the South. Let me just back up here. It says, the news and mutterings of great events were swiftly carried from one plantation to another. In the fear of Yankee invasions, the silverware and other valuables were taken from the big house, buried. That's what we called the big house on our homestead. The big house was the big log house that was being built while we lived in the little cabin. Buried in the woods and guarded by trusted slaves. Woe be to anyone who would have attempted to disturb that buried treasure. The slaves would give the Yankee soldiers food, drink, clothing, anything but that which was specifically entrusted to their care and honor. As the day grew nearer, there was more singing in the slave quarters than usual. It was bolder, had more ring, and lasted later into the night. Most of the verses of the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. True, they had sung these same verses before, but they had been careful to explain that the freedom of these songs referred to the next world, and had no connection with life in this world. Now they gradually threw off the mask, and were not afraid to let it be known that the freedom in their songs meant freedom of the body in this world. The night before the eventful day, word was sent to the slave quarters to the effect that something unusual was going to take place at the big house the next morning. There was little, if any, sleep that night. All was excitement and expectancy. Early the next morning, word was sent to all the slaves, old and young, to gather at the house. In company with my mother, brother, and sister, and a large number of other slaves, I went to the master's house. All of our master's family were either standing or seated on the veranda of the house, where they could see what was to take place and hear what was said. There was a feeling of deep interest, or perhaps sadness, on their faces, but not bitterness. As I now recall the impression they made upon me, they did not at the moment seem to be sad because of the loss of their property, but rather because of parting with those whom they had reared, and who were in so many ways very close to them. The most distinct thing that I now recall in connection with the scene was that some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper called the Emancipation Proclamation, I think. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children, while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearful that she would never live to see. For some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, There was pity among the slaves for our former owners. This wild rejoicing on the part of the emancipated colored people lasted but for a brief period, for I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabins there was a change in their feelings. The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan and work for themselves and their children, seemed to take possession of them now. It was very much like suddenly turning a youth of 10 or 12 years old out into the world to provide for himself. In a few hours the great questions with which the Anglo-Saxon race had been grappling for centuries had been thrown upon these people to be solved. These were the questions of a home, a living, rearing children, educating them, citizenship, and the establishment and support of churches. Was it any wonder that within a few hours the wild rejoicing ceased, and a feeling of deep gloom seemed to pervade these slave quarters? To some it seemed that now they were in actual possession of it, freedom was a more serious thing than they had expected to find. Some of the slaves were 70 or 80 years old, and their best days were gone. They had no strength with which to earn a living in a strange place and among strange people, even if they had been sure where to find a new place of abode. To this class the problem seemed especially hard. Besides, deep down in their hearts there was a strange and peculiar attachment to the old master and the old missus, and to their children, which they found it hard to think of breaking from. With these they had spent in some cases nearly half a century, and it was no light thing to think of parting. Gradually, one by one, stealthily at first, the older slaves began to wander from the slave quarters back to the big house to have whispered conversations with their former owners as to what they should do with their future. You know, I wish I could find the part where he said his mother talked to him, on how she said that although she had waited for this for a long time, that she was kind of sad because now there would be huge responsibilities on them. And there's something in here that I would like to read about how he got his education, and it was very, very interesting. So I'll read that to you maybe a little later on. I am going to read a few other things to you. But I thought you should know some of this because it's an autobiography from the man himself. And you can still get this brand new online. I mean, it's been reprinted. And I think it's very important. The homeschoolers are all aware of it, and they read it, and many people. In the 1950s, we had these biographies to read in the public school. And I think it's very important. It's a very important part of our history, and we all share this history. And to me, there are only people, when I first came on the web, the first thing that I was accused of was, and I had the homemaking articles, remember that? And so back in 2005, the trolls just came in swarms and accused me of being a racist and many other things, but I always explained that to me there are only two kinds of people, and those that love God and those that don't, and that's just all there is to it. That's the black and white that I believe in, those that live on the side of the Lord and those that don't, and those that live in darkness. So that is, this is in case you read anything about me that's been written on the web, this is what I believe. So everybody is a potential candidate for Christ. Now I'd like to also go and talk to you a little bit about the home and how dressing up can help you approach your home, and to make sure that at least there is one room, just today, just get one room ready that is presentable. And I would say the most logical room would probably be the one that is closest to the front door, the entry where someone's going to come in. At least keep that clean. And I've had some pop-in company lately, and that's the first thing I do is get that ready, shut all the other doors, shove off all the clutter into another room, and try to keep them in one room long enough to have their cup of tea and not feel like they need to get up and go tour. And eventually my goal, of course, is to make my house tourable, but it isn't right now. And I'd like to go on about how, the home can make a difference. And we listen to the news, even the conservative news. It's all so dreary, and it's not giving us any hope. And so I just wanted to say that where the difference will be made will be you in your home. Because if you look at the homeschool movement, it didn't start with a bunch of mothers going to march on the Capitol. It did not start with homeschool parents appealing to the president. It did not start with that. They simply believed that the Bible God wanted them and taught them in the Bible to train up and teach their own children, and to teach them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And they realized the public schools were not going to be able to do that, and that they would be losing their children eventually, spiritually and mentally and physically. So they just taught them at home. And this movement became so big just because the mothers decided to do this. Many of them didn't know there were other people doing it, but it came at a time when there was a change in curriculum in the public schools, and some of us began to notice it as some of the teaching, and we decided that wasn't right. We couldn't do that. And after maybe spending a few months kind of sparring with the officials at school, we realized it was too big of a monster to be able to defeat or change in order to accommodate your children. And that was when the light came on. We realized that we could not be served individually. We could not homeschool. Public school was one size fits all, and they wanted the children to turn out with the same beliefs. And so we just decided to quietly homeschool our children. We weren't making a big splash. We weren't throwing a fit. And that's how things changed, because eventually it became so big that it caught the attention of the state and of the government. And that was when other people and politicians decided to do what they could to make it more amiable to the state. Now, to us, it didn't matter whether it was legal or not. And so when I hear somebody say, well, in our state it's legal, well, it wouldn't have mattered to me whether it was legal or not, because not everything that's legal is right. Can you think of all the things in your state that are legal now? Would you do them just because they're legal? So with me, it didn't matter whether they were legal. It mattered whether they were right by God's standards, which is the Bible. And so I knew that, and every mother knew that they could not, in all good conscience, leave their children in a public school. And this was a time in the 1980s when many mothers were still home and still being homemakers, and they had time to research this, and also and the will to teach their own children at home. So with the turmoil that's going on in the world, just remember that example, that we did not have to wait until the world was just right before we homeschooled our kids. And I do know families who said, well, I would really like to do that, but I want to see how yours turn out first. Well, in the meantime, we know families whose children fell into all kinds of trouble because of the influence of the teachings that went on in the public schools, and eventually left the church, left their families, and just couldn't seem to get their lives together. Well, it's the same thing today. You know, we're thinking, well, if we could just get this old world to straighten out, you know, we could get things back the way they were, and then we can breathe a little bit. You know, I wouldn't do that at all. I'll do just like I did the homeschooling. I'll do what's right for my home and for my family. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the tension that the news media creates, whether it's conservative or religious or just, you know, the regular communist news media. It can make you tense because it makes you stop breathing. I don't know if you realize that you have stopped breathing. And for that reason, I have begun to start taking breathing exercises. I'll go find a tutorial on YouTube, and I've been taking exercises too. And then learning that made me realize how often I'm not breathing, or that I've held my breath, or that I'm breathing so shallowly. And then, of course, your back starts to ache, and then, of course, you're tense. And so what we have to do is remember that God gave us life. He expects us to breathe. And so what I would suggest you do is breathe in a prayer and breathe out a praise. If you could think of a prayer as you breathe in and breathe out something that's praiseworthy, and practice that. And also remember that breathing gives life, and You breathe in oxygen. That's very important. And some of you that are suffering from things like hair loss or skin problems or just joint problems, all kinds of problems, might benefit from just breathing, from also fear, anxiety, that kind of thing might benefit more from proper breathing. And I have benefited so much from this. And so that is the thing, is that, and when I first began homeschooling, I went through that, the tenseness, and just the anxiety because of some of the things that people would say to me. They would tell me some very cruel things, but it was never enough to make me quit. And you have to learn to breathe away the anxiety. You have to learn every time it comes. Don't hang on to it. Don't let your back get stiff. Don't hold your breath. And so when this bad news comes, and we all know that it's pretty difficult out there, it's hard to go get the services and the things you need done without being treated like you're an enemy. And so that's why many people are staying home. And out of sympathy, I've been staying home more just to figure out what it would be like for some of these people that are totally at home and can't go anywhere for some reason or other. Now, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your home and how important it is to breathe properly around every big job that you see. You might walk in and say, oh my goodness, that's such a mess. I've got to go through all that. Breathe. And so I just wanted to emphasize that more. And then I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Mcguffey's Fourth Reader and why it was my favorite and why I like it the best. There's also the one called the Christian Liberty Reader, and it's the Fourth Reader, but I don't have a copy of it right here. And it is the one that has the Alfred the Great story in it. It's the one that has Susie's composition in it. Remember the mother who wanted her daughter to write a story or a composition on something, and her daughter didn't know how, and so she sent her outside. She said, you just go outside. It was a summer's day. I must admit that most of Mcguffey readers have been written from a northern viewpoint because there's so many snowstorm stories in these. It just makes you cold, But perhaps in the southern hemisphere you have old readers from the 1800s that have been in reprint that you could use. And so it also had the story of the Hugh Idle and Mr. Toil, I believe, and it has the speech, the practice of speech. Like in here it has the sub-vocals combined and the many words that they have to learn to say and how not to say them. Like you say thanks, not thankst. And I never thought of that thinks, not thinkst. And circled, not circles. And apparently this reflects a lot of the way that language was misused in the olden days. And health, not healths. And just the little abbreviations that they use, and they tried to perfect it all so that we would have a common language, a common way of speaking English throughout the whole nation. I want to also read to you a little bit more from Booker T. Washington's book about his education, because I think that this is very helpful in keeping house in a way. And this is the example where he went to work for a teacher. And he wanted to get an education, and he went to work for a teacher. And somewhere in here, I hadn't really found it, but I'm going to read a little bit. She said, the children are out playing, now sweep the floor. And so he learned that you can't fail if you always have some work to do and if you approach it with delight. So I just want to read a little bit more of this. And it says here that he had always wanted an education. And so I'll just see what about how determined he was. From the time that I can remember having any thoughts about anything, I recall that I had an intense longing to learn to read. I determined when quite a small child that if I accomplished nothing else in life, I would in some way get enough education to enable me to read common books and newspapers. Soon after we got settled in some manner in our new cabin in West Virginia, I induced, by the way, there was a description of this new cabin before this. I won't read it to you, but he was saying that the living conditions in these new cabins in West Virginia were appalling compared to the southern slave cabins. He was talking about how small they were, how the sanitation was terrible, how it was filled with people who had absolutely no manners or morals. They would get drunk at night. They'd even set the places on fire. And he said the filth about the cabins was intolerable. And he's talking about this new place in West Virginia for which he moved from the South so that they could have a better life and get an education. He said, despite the poor conditions of our plantation cabins, we were at all times sure of pure air. Our new home was in the midst of a cluster of cabins crowded closely together, and there was no sanitary regulations. The filth about the cabins was intolerable. Some of our neighbors were colored people, and some were the poorest, most ignorant, degraded white people. It was a motley mixture. Drinking, gambling, quarrels, fights, and shocking immoral practices were frequent. All who lived in the little town were in one way or another connected with the salt business. Though I was a mere child, my stepfather put me and my brother at work in one of the furnaces. Often I began work as early as 4 o'clock in the morning. The first thing I ever learned in the way of book knowledge was while working in this salt furnace. Each salt packer had his barrels marked with a certain number. The number allotted to my stepfather was 18. At the close of the day's work, the boss of the packers would come around and put 18 on each of our barrels, and I soon learned to recognize that figure wherever I saw it, and after a while got to the point where I could make that figure, although I knew nothing about figures or letters. Now, we have discovered this with raising children at home, how easily they learn to read. Just sitting in the car or going somewhere with you, they'll read the license plates. They will learn to say the letters. They will say the letters at the top of a grocery store that you happen to drive up to or whatever, and they will learn to say the words of a favorite restaurant that you go to, and they'll learn to read. There are 26 letters with 44 sounds, I believe, so it's a code that is actually can be picked up quite easily. In fact, in my family, the younger children learn to read without the lessons sometimes because they were listening to the lessons of the older ones. Soon after we got settled in our in some manner in our new cabin in West Virginia, I induced my mother to get a hold of a book for me. How or where she got it, I do not know, but in some way she procured an old copy of Webster's Blueback Spelling Book. Now, some of the homeschoolers have gotten reproductions of those, and I have one somewhere, which contained the alphabet, followed by such meaningless words as ab, ba, ca, and da. I began at once to devour this book, and I think that it was the first one I had ever had in my hands. I had learned from somebody that the way to begin to read was to learn the alphabet, so I tried in all the ways I could think of to learn it, and of course without a teacher, for I could find no one to teach me. At the time there was not a single member of my race anywhere near who could read, and I was too timid to approach any of the white people. In some way, within a few weeks, I mastered the greater portion of the alphabet. In all my efforts to learn to read, my mother shared fully my ambition and sympathized with me and aided me in every way that she could. Though she was totally ignorant, so far as mere book knowledge was concerned, she had high ambitions for her children and a large fund of good, hard common sense, which seemed to enable her to meet and master every situation. If I had done anything in life worth attention, I feel sure that I inherited my disposition from my mother. At this time, the question of having some kind of school opened for the colored children of the village began to be discussed by members of the race. As it would be the first school for Negro children that had ever been opened in that part of Virginia, it was, of course, to be a great event, and the discussion excited the wildest of interests. And then he goes on about this school and how, for some reason, he was working and wasn't able to attend. Says, my mother, the opening of the school in Kanawha Valley, however, brought me one of the keenest disappointments I have ever experienced. I had been working in the salt furnace for several months, and my stepfather had discovered that I had financial value, so when the school opened, he decided he could not spare me from my work. This decision seemed to cloud my every ambition. The disappointment was made all the more severe by reason of the fact that my place of work was where I could see the happy children passing to and from school mornings and afternoons. Despite this disappointment, however, I determined that I would learn something every day anyway. I applied myself with greater earnestness than ever to the mastering of what was in the blueback speller. My mother sympathized with me in my disappointment, and sought to comfort me in all the ways that she could, and to help me find a way to learn. After a while I succeeded in making arrangements with the teacher to give me some lessons at night, after the day's work was done. These night lessons were so welcome that I think I learned more at night than all the children did during the day. My own experiences in the night school gave me faith in the night school idea, in which, after years, I had to do both at Hampton and Tuskegee. But my boyish heart was still set on going to the day school, and I let no opportunity slip to push my case. Finally, I won, and I was permitted to go to the school in the day for a few months, and with the understanding that I was to rise early in the morning, work at the furnace till 9 o'clock, and return immediately after school closed in the afternoon for at least 2 more hours of work. The schoolhouse was some distance from the furnace, and as I had to work till 9 o'clock, and the school opened for me, I found myself in difficulty. School would always be begun before I reached it, and sometimes my class had recited. For some reason, what's crossed my mind while reading this is that we had these books in the libraries in the 1950s and often checked them out and read them and had to do book reports. And so we had this book, we had the book about George Washington Carver and many other people of that era. We read about them. And every Christian school student and homeschool student will have these books. And that's why homeschooling and Christian schooling are different. And a lot of people think that we homeschool because we want to be home, or that you go to a Christian school because you just want to be around Christians. That's not it. It's what is in these books. And I will read to you out of the grammar and composition later on to show you what the difference is on what their minds are dwelling on. It's what our minds, it's not about dissecting or punctuating a sentence. It's what is the sentence you are diagramming. What is it saying to you? And if it's nonsensical, these people that run the public schools, they know, the ones that do the books, create the books, they know how to indoctrinate you through these things, just as the Christians know how to indoctrinate you the other way. All school is indoctrination, but you have to choose what kind that you want. However, when I found myself at school for the first time, I found myself confronted with 2 other difficulties. In the first place, I found that all of the children wore hats or caps on their heads, and I had neither a hat nor a cap. In fact, I do not remember that up to the time of going to school I'd ever worn any kind of covering on my head, nor do I recall that I or anybody else had even thought about the need for covering my head. But of course, when I saw how the other boys were dressed, I began to feel quite uncomfortable. As usual, I put the case before my mother, and she explained to me that she had no money with which to buy a straw hat, which was a rather new institution at the time among the members of my race, and was considered quite the thing for young and old to own. But she would try to find a way to help me out of the difficulty. Now, if you look at the old photographs of that era, the men, young and old, did wear hats. It was just a matter of dressing up in pride. She accordingly got 2 pieces of homespun and sewed them together. That's like jeans fabric. And I was soon the proud possessor of my first cap. The lesson that my mother taught me in this has always remained with me, and I have tried as best I could to teach it to others. I have always felt proud, whenever I think of the incident, that my mother had strength of character enough not to be led into the temptation of seeming to be that which she was not, of trying to impress my schoolmates and others with the fact that she was able to buy me a store hat when she was not. I've always felt proud that she refused to go into debt for the thing which she did not have the money to pay for. Since that time I have owned many kinds of caps and hats, but never one that I have felt so proud of as the cap of the 2 pieces of cloth sewn together by my mother. I have noted that fact without satisfaction. I need not add that several of the boys who began their careers with store hats and who were my schoolmates used to join in the sport that was made of me. They made fun of him because I had only a homespun cap, and have ended their careers in the penitentiary while others were not able to buy any new kind of hat. That's interesting, isn't it? My second difficulty was with regard to my name, or rather a name. From the time that I could remember anything, I had been called simply Booker. Before going to school, it had never occurred to me that it was needful or appropriate to have an additional name. When I heard the school roll called, I noticed that all of the children had at least 2 names, and some of them indulged in what seemed to me the extravagance of having 3. I was in deep perplexity because I knew that the teacher would demand of me at least 2 names, and I had only 1. By the time the occasion came for the enrolling of my name, an idea occurred to me that I thought would make me equal to the situation. And so, when the teacher asked me for what my full name was, I calmly told him Booker Washington, as if I had been called by that name all my life, and by that name I have been since known. This reminds me of my father. We moved to Australia from Alaska when I was a teenager, and he wanted to get a job hired with operating heavy equipment, and so he didn't know how to operate everything, but he had a tractor when he was growing up, a John Deere, and he had homesteaded and had several pieces of equipment. But when we got to Australia, the equipment was a little different, and he had said he could handle heavy equipment. And when he got to the job, he didn't recognize any of the instruments on this heavy equipment, so he asked an Australian to come and tell him. He said, it's a little different where I come from, and I don't recall any of these. And he had the Australian show him how to do it, and he kept his job. You have to think quick sometimes. And by that name I have been known ever since. Later in my life I found that my mother had given me the name of Booker Taliaferro soon after I was born, but in some way that part of my name seemed to disappear for a long time, was forgotten. But as I found out about it, I revived it and printed my name, Booker Taliaferro Washington. I think there are not many men in our country who've had the privilege of naming themselves in the way that I have. More than once I have tried to picture myself in the position of a boy or man with an honored and distinguished ancestry, which I could trace back through a period of hundreds of years, and who had not only inherited a name but a fortune and a proud family homestead. And yet I have sometimes had the feeling that if I had inherited these, and had been a member of a more popular race, I should have been inclined to yield to the temptation of depending upon my ancestry and my color to do for me the things that I should do for myself. Years ago I resolved that because I had no ancestry myself, I would leave a record of which my children would be proud, and create an ancestry for them, of which might encourage them to still a higher effort. Ladies, this is something that I've been trying to tell you when I talk about homemaking, and women maybe who've been brought up by families that didn't really care about homemaking, and who wanted their daughters to have jobs instead, or who didn't really have mothers who really wanted to nurture them or care about the home. That what you do is you use that misfortune as a signal to go and create something for your own children, to create a legacy for your own children, to create that motherhood and the memories for your own children that you didn't have. Because there's no use in sitting around in bitterness and saying that, I didn't have the privilege that so-and-so had. And let's say you came from a family that doesn't have a good name or a good reputation or doesn't have money. You can, in many ways, create a good life for your family by determination. And many of the things that I have read to you about Booker T. Washington's mother are so impressive. I will read a little bit more to you, and then I want to go on to something else. So some of you who are mothers and grandmothers, this is your homeschooling. You're being homeschooled, and you can tell people, I'm being homeschooled right now. because that way you didn't miss out on anything. And so then you know, see, now that you know what it is, it's what homeschooling is what is in the materials. It's the thoughts and the teaching and the values in the materials, and it is reading. Once I started to read a paragraph to my children, I'd just take the old world history and geography book and I'd read one paragraph to them. And it just electrified their taste for it, and I'd set that book down somewhere, and next thing I know, someone had snatched it and taken it away. I had to order 2 books one time just because some of them were taking over these books, but it has a lot to do with reading and telling and talking, but it's also the material. So that now that you know what it is, you know what to look for, and you know how to do it. So some of you who are elderly now and have great-grandchildren, you can proudly say, well, I know about homeschooling because I'm being homeschooled. So I'm going to read a little bit more to you about this because it's actually is very good for the home. After it talked about his name, he talked about his name and how important it was to him. Well, I'm looking for the part about his struggle for an education. So I want to read about this teacher that I have talked about this for several times. I've talked to you about it. So I wanted to read it to you, and I'm hoping you're getting something done. If you've got something to fold or you've got something to clean out, this might be fun to listen to. It's his struggle for education. Now, in those days, education truly was education. It was worthwhile. It had value. It had good values in it. Today, of course, we know the public schools have been taken over by indoctrination, which they like to indoctrinate the student into hating their country, hating their parents, and hating religion, hating the Lord. And even though you might not see it in so many words, the fact that there's nothing there to encourage them to have this character and this love for home, family, country, and church, it will be replaced by nothingness, which is worse. One day while at work in the coal mine, I happened to overhear 2 miners talking about a great school for colored people somewhere in Virginia. This was the first time I'd ever heard anything about any kind of school or college. In the darkness of the mine, I noiselessly crept as close as I could to the 2 men who were talking. I heard one tell the other that not only was the school established for the members of my race, but that opportunities were provided by which poor but worthy students could work out all or part of the cost and at the same time be taught a trade or industry. I'm just going to check my volume because some people have complained that they can't hear me. As they went on describing the school, it seemed to me that it must be the greatest place on earth, and not even heaven presented more attractions for me at that time than did the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, about which these men were talking. I resolved at once to go to that school, although I had no idea where it was, or how many miles away, or how I was going to reach it. I remember only that I was on fire constantly with one ambition, and that was to go to Hampton. This thought was with me day and night. After hearing of the Hampton Institute, I continued to work for a few months longer in the coal mine. While at work there, I heard of a vacant position in the household of General Lewis Ruffner, the owner of the salt furnace and coal mine. Mrs. Viola Ruffner, the wife of General Ruffner, was a Yankee woman from Vermont. Mrs. Ruffner had a reputation all through the vicinity for being very strict with her servants, and especially with the boys who tried to serve her. Few of them had remained with her for more than 2 or 3 weeks. They all left with the same excuse: she was too strict. I decided, however, that I would rather try Miss Ruffner's house than remain in the coal mine. So my mother applied to her for the vacant position. I was hired at a salary of $5 a month. I had heard so much about Mrs. Ruffner's severity that I was almost afraid to see her, and trembled when I went into her presence. I had not lived with her many weeks, however, before I began to understand her. I soon began to learn that, first of all, she wanted everything kept clean about her, that she wanted things done properly and systematically. Now, here's the problem with children sometimes. They will say, Mother, you're just too strict. They don't get it. I want this cleaned up. And they're not looking at the bigger message. They're just looking at the mother saying, I would like to have this cleaned up, and they'll just say, well, you're too strict. They're not looking at the fact that she wants things clean. You see what I'm saying? And people are really good at diverting attention from the real situation. She wanted things done promptly and systematically, and that at the bottom of everything she wanted absolute honesty and frankness. Nothing must be sloven or slipshod. Every door, every fence must be kept in repair. I cannot recall how long I had lived with Mrs. Ruffner before going to Hampton, but I think it must have been a year and a half. At any rate, I here repeat what I have said more than once before, that the lessons I learned in the home of Mrs. Ruffner were as valuable to me as any education I have ever gotten anywhere since. Even to this day, I never see bits of paper scattered around a house or in the street that I do not want to pick up at once. I never see a filthy yard that I do not want to clean, a paling off of a fence that I do not want to put it on, an unpainted and unwhitewashed house that I do not want to paint or whitewash, or a button off of one's clothes, or a grease spot on them or on the floor that I do not want to call attention to it. From fearing Mrs. Ruffner, I soon learned to look upon her as one of my best friends. When she found that she could trust me, she did so implicitly. During the 1 or 2 winters that I was with her, she gave me an opportunity to go to school for an hour in the day during a portion of the winter months. But most of my studying was done at night, sometimes alone, sometimes under someone whom I could hire to teach me. Mrs. Ruffner always encouraged and sympathized with me in all my efforts to get an education. It was while living with her that I began to get together my first library. I secured a dry goods box, knocked out one side of it, put some shelves in it, and began putting into it every kind of book that I could get my hands on and call it my library. Notwithstanding my success at Mrs. Ruffner's, did I not give up the idea of going to the Hampton Institute. In the fall of 1872, I determined to make an effort to get there, although, as I have stated, I had no definite idea of the direction in which Hampton was, or of what it would cost to go there. I do not think that any one thoroughly sympathized with me in my ambition to get to Hampton, unless it was my mother. At any rate, I got only a half-hearted consent from her that I might start. The small amount of money that I had earned had been consumed by my stepfather and the remainder of my family, with the exception of a very few dollars, so I had very little with which to buy clothes and buy my traveling expenses. My brother John helped me all that he could, but of course that was not a great deal, for his work was also in the coal mines, where he did not earn much, and most of what he did earn went into the direction of paying the household expenses. Perhaps the thing that touched and pleased me most in connection with my starting for Hampton was the interest that many of the older colored people took in the matter. They had spent the best of their days in slavery and hardly expected to see the time when they would see a number of their own race leave home to attend school. Some of these older people would give me a nickel, others a quarter, or a handkerchief. Finally the day came and I headed for Hampton. I had only a small cheap satchel that contained what few articles of clothing I could get. My mother at the time was rather weak and broken in health. I hardly expected to see her again, and thus our parting was the more sad. She, however, was very brave through it all. At that time there were no trains connecting that part of West Virginia and Eastern Virginia. Trains ran only a portion of the way, and the remainder of the distance was traveled by stagecoaches. So I'll read to you more about this another time. And the teacher that he worked with was so interesting. Well, maybe I'll read a little bit about the teacher, and then I'll let you go, and I hope that you get something done. As soon as possible after reaching the grounds of Hampton Institute, I presented myself before the head teacher for assignment to a class. Having been so long without proper food, a bath, a change of clothing, I did not, of course, make a very favorable impression on her, and I could see at once that there were doubts in her mind about the wisdom of admitting me as a student. I felt that I could hardly blame her if she got the idea I was a worthless loafer or a tramp. For some time she did not refuse to admit me. Neither did she decide in my favor, and I continued to linger around her, and to impress her in all ways I could with my worthiness. In the meantime I saw her admitting other students, and that added greatly to my discomfort, for I felt, deep down in my heart, that I could do well just as they could if I could only get the chance. After some hours had passed, the head teacher said to me, "The adjoining recitation room needs sweeping. Take the broom and sweep it." It occurred to me at once that here was my chance. Never did I receive an order with more delight. I knew that I could sweep, for Mrs. Ruffner had thoroughly taught me how to do that when I lived with her. I swept the recitation room 3 times, then I got a dusting cloth and I dusted it 4 times. All the woodwork around the walls, every bench, table, and desk, I went over 4 times with my dusting cloth. Besides, every piece of furniture that had been moved, every closet, every corner in the room had been thoroughly cleaned. I had the feeling that in the very large measure my future depended on the impression I made upon the teacher with the cleaning of that room. When I was through, I reported to the head teacher. She was a Yankee woman who knew just where to look for dirt. She went into the room and inspected the floor and closets. Then she took her handkerchief and rubbed it on the woodwork around the walls and over the table and benches. When she was unable to find one bit of dirt on the floor or one particle of dust on any of the furniture, she quietly remarked, "I guess you will do to enter the institution." It was one of the happiest days of my life. I was one of the happiest souls on earth. The sweeping of that room was my college examination, and never did any youth pass an examination for an entrance into Harvard or Yale that gave him more genuine satisfaction. I have passed several examinations since then, but I have always felt that this was the best I had ever passed. Now, ladies, you think at the home, don't you, when you read stuff like that? If you were reading things like this to your children, how much different they would feel about homemaking and housework and just keeping the property in good repair and looking nice. And this was a great source of pride to people of all races in that day and age. And I think of your job as a homemaker is more than just you doing the job. You can also pass on good habits and good attitudes to others around you in your family. And so today I hope you have gotten a few things done while you listened, and I want to read next time. I'd like to read a chapter out of Anne of Green Gables, and there's a reason for that, and I will talk to you about it later. So I'll see you next time. Bye.